and the Federal Reserve conspirators were struggling. So these four men, they were a man called John Jacob Astor, who was regarded as being the richest man in the world. Benjamin Guggenheim, who was an American entrepreneur, railroad and mining. Isidor Straus, who was head of Macy's, who owned Macy's department store, and he was a very, very rich man. He had a lot of other financial interests, and a gentleman by the name of Charles Lindbergh. So, of those four men who were opposed to the setting up of the Federal Reserve, three of them died on Titanic.
Aloha and welcome to another episode, guys. Today I'm thrilled to have John Hemmer back on the show. We're diving deep into the controversial topic of the Titanic, exploring theories that challenges the official story we've all heard about. But before we get started, I want to remind you to review, subscribe, follow, and share this show if you've enjoyed the content. And as always, the opinions expressed by my guest today do not necessarily reflect my own or those of the show. Now, let's jump right into it. John, welcome back. Well, I'm really looking forward to today's chat because we're diving into something that's both controversial and intriguing. The idea that the Titanic didn't sink, but her sister ship, the Olympic, that did.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a topic that's been on my mind, so I can't wait to hear your take on it. So,
okay.
Yeah, so John, what initially got you interested in the Titanic and its history?
Right. Well, I'd always been interested in the Titanic. I think, a lot of people are, because it's such a dramatic story, isn't it? It's got everything. It's got, drama, it's got romance, it's got, a disaster, it's got rich versus poor. It's just a very, very dramatic and a compelling story, isn't it? And I think a lot of people are fascinated by it. But we've been told so many lies about it. I actually started looking into it in about 2009, 2010. And I researched it for about 3 years and ended up writing a couple of books on it. The reason I wrote 2 books was because I did a presentation which appeared on YouTube and it went viral, and it had about 500,000 views in the first 3 months. And it was spotted by a Hollywood film director, and she invited me over there because she wanted to make a film of the alternative story. And so we spent a week or so, a bit longer than a week, trying to raise interest from film producers in Hollywood. So I stayed at her house in the Hollywood Hills for a little while, and we spent some time doing that, and nobody was interested. Surprisingly, unsurprisingly, should I say. But apart from one guy who said, yeah, it sounds, intriguing, but it has to be based on a book. So I came back home to England and I wrote the book which is called RMS Olympic, and sent him the transcript. And he said, no, it's got to be a novel. I guess I wrote a factual book, of course. I'm not a novel writer, really. So I went away again and wrote a novel, and that took a few months, and sent that to him, and he just said, well, no, I'm sorry, I'm not interested anymore. So it was a bit of a waste of time in a sense, but at least I got 2 books out of it. So yeah, I spent a lot of time pouring through all the public records for Harland and Wolff, which is the shipyard where it was built, the transcripts of the 2 public inquiries after the event. There was the American inquiry, which happened first, and then there was the British inquiry. Lots and lots of information in there. I spent time going around libraries, searching contemporary newspaper reports of it. Obviously, use the internet and at a place called the Bodleian Library in Oxford, in England. Is the only place where they keep the transcripts of all the wireless messages that were passing between the ships in the North Atlantic on that evening. So that stuff isn't available on the internet. So I spent a couple of or 3 days down there in Oxford, and I found some very, very interesting information, shall we say, which hasn't been made public.
Yeah, I read that. Sorry, there seems like sometimes there's a reverberation. So I'm sorry, I
Right.
don't know if you hear that or not.
I don't, but I'll put my headphones on. That will probably make it better, won't it? Just bear with
Sorry.
me. No, it's all right. I'll just bear with me a second. This will probably cut out the noise.
Okay. Yeah, it did.
Is that
Can you
better?
hear me?
I
Yes.
can hear you perfectly. Yeah. Is that better for you?
Okay. Yes, there's no reverberation now. Okay.
All right.
Thank you. So I'll take that part out. So
Yeah.
you mentioned in your research that you went to the public references library where you spent
Yes.
many hours, actually days, like you said, going
Mm.
through the contemporary newspaper reports, the transcripts of the two official inquiries into the
Yeah.
disaster. And you've explored the Harland and the Wolff's public records.
Yeah.
The
Harland and
orig-
Wolff was the shipyard where the ships were built.
Right. And you said that only at this library in Oxford where you can see the full transcript of what they were talking about, or the wireless transcript.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. So when you read that, was it completely different from everything we are hearing of today or what we know of the Titanic? Could you elaborate?
Absolutely. The story that you hear, the popular story that we all kind of know and love about Titanic is absolutely, it's not true. It's not true. It's all made up.
Wow. So there are many suspicious elements. The
Absolutely.
ongoing
Yeah.
coal fires, the lifeboats that are not prepared until an hour after impact, the unusual number of first class passengers canceling last minute, nearby ships failing to assist, all of
Yeah.
those things that are pointing to more than something just an accident. So
Yeah.
I'd like to hear your story, I guess, from the beginning of what really happened.
Okay. Well, I mean, first of all, Maya, let me tell you, there is so much to relate in this story. For example, I once did a 4-hour podcast on this subject and didn't cover everything. There is so much, but obviously everything is in my book, RMS Olympic. It's all in there. But anyway, okay. So I think most people know that the incident happened at it was around about 11:40 p.m. on Sunday, the 14th of April, 1912, and the ship sank at approximately 2:20 a.m. on Monday the 15th, with local time, by the way. So that was North Atlantic time. Now, the official story, the one that we all know, and I think we know and hear, was actually a book written by a CIA agent by the name of Walter Lord in the early 1950s. And this book was called The Night to Remember. And that kind of set alarm bells in my head straight away, because I kind of questioned, what on earth was a CIA agent doing writing a story about a shipwreck that had happened 40 years earlier and distorting all the facts? It was all rather strange to me anyway. And my research kind of bore that out. So I'll tell the story. There are 2 strands to it. Okay, so bear in mind, we'll kind of swap between them a little bit. But it began in 1908. A gentleman by the name of J.P. Morgan, whose name still exists in the company that is still, this still bears his name. He was head of a huge financial conglomerate corporation, And he was also the owner of the White Star shipping line, which is what Titanic and its sister ship Olympic belonged to. Now, they decided to build 3 luxury liners. And JP Morgan's idea was to make them the most luxurious in the world, or the world, the world had ever seen. And these were going to be, first of all, the Olympic, RMS Olympic, RMS Titanic, and RMS Britannic. So there was going to be 3 identical, or more or less identical, sister ships, if you like. So he commissioned Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast, in Northern Ireland, to commence construction in that year, 1908. Now, it required a massive investment of money, and this is a very important point, which we'll come on to later. It needed a massive investment of money, and this was financed by JP Morgan himself, and it was a huge gamble for him. Even though he was a very rich man, the plan depended on absolutely everything going right. But as we'll see, as we go through it, the whole enterprise was hit with problems, which obviously ultimately ended in tragedy, of course. Now, RMS Olympic was the first of the 3 sisters to be built. She was launched in 1911. But unfortunately for Morgan, she had several serious accidents, 4 in all before the launch of Titanic. So in other words, all in the first few months of Olympic's life. First of all, on a maiden voyage, she destroyed a tugboat in New York Harbor, and White Star Line was sued for quite a large amount of money, but fortunately there were no deaths. And Olympic wasn't really damaged significantly at all, so that wasn't a big deal. And then secondly, a couple of voyages later, it ran over a sunken wreck at a place called Sandy Hook whilst leaving New York, which caused severe damage to her propellers. And she returned back across the Atlantic at around half speed because of the severe vibration. She actually suffered further vibrational damage due to the imbalance caused by the propeller damage, and 2 propellers had to be replaced. And then shortly after that, on another voyage, she hit a sandbank, ran aground, and threw a propeller. What threw a propeller just means the propeller was destroyed, fallen off, fell off. This also had to be replaced, but having already used both spares, they had to borrow one from the Titanic, which was still under construction. And this is significant, and we'll return to that point later in the story. So yeah, and then the most serious accident of them all, in September 1911, which was a few months before Titanic was launched, Olympic was involved in a massive high-speed collision with a British Navy battleship called HMS Hawke, which is known in Titanic circles as the Hawke incident. And this was after leaving Southampton on the south coast of England and preparing to turn west towards her destination, which was New York, of course. So yeah, she was seriously damaged. She limped back to Southampton, which was a home dock, to be patched up. Just the patch up took 3 weeks just to get her in a fit state to get her back to Harland and Wolff Shipyard in Belfast for full repairs. Because the dry dock where she was built, don't forget she was the biggest ship in the world at this point, the dry dock where she was built was the only dry dock in the world big enough to take her. And it was realised once they got her there, which took a long time to patch her up just for that short voyage, they realised that she was in far worse shape than they originally thought. And worse still, whenever there's an incident involving a British Navy battleship or any kind of ship, there has to be an official Royal Navy inquiry. And this inquiry into this accident found that Olympic's crew, and therefore White Star Line, was culpable. It was their fault. Now, White Star was thus liable for many millions of pounds of expenses for repairs to both ships. And that, coupled with the significant loss of revenue, because if you remember, I said that Morgan had invested lots and lots of money in it and he needed everything to go right. But the problem was, Olympic was out of action for months. So she wasn't earning her keep. She wasn't generating revenue to keep the the wheels in motion kind of thing. So amongst many relatively minor issues, the major problem was that Olympic's keel was bent and distorted out of shape, and the repairs were estimated to cost more than to build a new ship from scratch. Now, I spoke to several experienced mariners, and they all said the same thing, and that is that a twisted or bent keel equals a total wreck. Okay, the ship was a wreck. So White Star now realized that Olympic was damaged beyond economic repair, and significantly that she was absolutely uninsurable. She was therefore an insurance write-off, and White Star Line had no option at all but to officially declare her as a wreck. And that actually did happen. Olympic was officially declared a wreck, and documentary evidence proved this to be absolutely true. So, as I said, due to the serious damage, she was unable to ply her trade back and forth across the Atlantic to begin to pay her way. And this led to, the very strong possibility that White Star Line and Harland and Wolff Shipyard was definitely, a strong possibility, because Harland and Wolff only built ships for White Star. So, it was going to be a real problem. So at this point, JP Morgan, I believe, and his co-conspirators then hatched a plan to kill two birds with one stone in a way. And this was to solve the White Star financial problems and also remove opposition to the Federal Reserve Bank in one simple move. Now, this is where the second strand to the story comes in. Excuse me, my voice is very shaky at the moment. I do apologize. Just bear with me. Yeah. So this is where the second strand of the story comes into play. In 1910, 7 men met at a place called Jekyll Island, which is just off the coast of Georgia. And the idea was to usurp the creation of money from the American government and turn it into a private company. And this was to be the Federal Reserve. Now, there was a lot of opposition to this idea. And in particular, 4 men in particular were opposed to the Federal Reserve Bank, and they were fighting against Morgan and his cohorts' plans to bring about the creation of the Federal Reserve Bank. And this was, as I say, it began in 1910, this opposition. Now, and the opposition were winning. Okay, they were getting a lot of support, and the Federal Reserve conspirators were struggling. So these 4 men, they were a man called John Jacob Astor, who was regarded as being the richest man in the world. Benjamin Guggenheim, who was an American entrepreneur, railroad and mining. Isidore Straus, who was head of Macy's, who owned Macy's department store, and he was a very, very rich man. He had a lot of other financial interests. And a gentleman by the name of Charles Lindbergh. Now, Charles Lindbergh was the father of the famous flyer, Charles Lindbergh Jr., who was actually the first man to fly solo across the Atlantic. But that's sort of the story. So, of those 4 men who were opposed to the setting up of the Federal Reserve, 3 of them died on Titanic. Okay, and I'll come on to that shortly. So, yeah. So anyway, back to the story about the ship itself. They had to patch up the wrecked Olympic as best they could. They braced the twisted keel with metal struts to make it viable for just one last voyage. Now, when the Titanic wreck was discovered in 1985 by a guy by the name of Robert Ballard, he didn't actually discover it, but that's another story altogether for another day. Okay, he was puzzled to find these struts, which were supporting the keel, and of course they didn't appear on the original construction blueprint. And he had a big copy of the actual original blueprint, and it was also possible to see on the wreck the repairs to an Olympic superstructure and steel plates in some pictures. So yeah, so I believe that the scene was now set for a remarkable and elaborate scam, which was the switching of the identities of the two ships. They almost completed Titanic and they almost wrecked Olympic. Now, this fact has been corroborated by many Belfast shipworkers' families who had this story passed down to them through their families. And I actually put an ad in the Belfast paper to ask if any of the shipworkers' families, descendants obviously, would be interested in meeting me and talking to me. And 4 families replied, and I met them all individually. And they all told me the same story, and that was that they said that it was common knowledge at that time that the ship's identities were switched. And they were also warned, their ancestors, whether it be the grandfather, the great-grandfather, or whatever it was, were also warned that if they ever breathed a word about what was going on, then, you know, not only would they never work again at Harland and Wolff, but they would never work again anywhere. And in those days of no social security, no welfare support at all, you know, that could have been a death sentence, basically. So, yeah, that was quite interesting. I actually heard that straight from the horse's mouth, if you like. So, right, what happened was, after Olympic's accident with Hawke, as I said, she spent many weeks in the shipyard at Belfast, and they were undergoing repairs and patching up. And now these changes were made bit by bit. And they also worked on Titanic to eradicate the main differences in the two ships. They were almost identical, but not quite. Okay, so they worked for weeks and weeks on changing the ships to look as identical as possible, although that wasn't 100% possible or practical. And so this is how the plot's been discovered, through meticulous research, basically, because there are lots of photographs of them showing them in the various stages of transition. And then on the final weekend, just before the last changes were made, all the lifeboats, menus, letterheads, and of course the nameplates were changed. And this was carried out by a small crew of insiders. And these men were paid the equivalent of a year's wages for a weekend's work. And they were also threatened with a loss of livelihood in the event of their speaking out about it. So, interestingly enough, when Olympic's maiden voyage took place in June 1911, there was virtually no razzmatazz fanfare at all about it. And then when Titanic was launched in December 1911, I believe she was renamed the Olympic, and work continued on the original Olympic, which had now become Titanic, to make her seaworthy enough for one dramatic final voyage. And there are so many conflicting photographs of the two in various stages of changes that even so-called experts struggle to separate the two. Of course, most photos in those days had no dates. And if surreptitious changes were being made alongside official ones, then the conclusion has to be that photos proved nothing at all. However, in my book, RMS Olympic, there are a series of photographs in there that I believe do prove the switch. Now, all passenger ships in those days had to have a certificate of seaworthiness. I'm sure they still do. And this involved a sea trial on open seas, which involved things like stopping, starting, turning circles, maneuverability, adequate number of lifeboats, etc., etc. Interestingly enough, Olympic's sea trial had taken a full day out on the open sea, on the Irish Sea, whereas Titanic's, which had obviously it was Olympic again, but it had now become Titanic. But Titanic's sea trial only lasted a couple of hours, and she never even went onto the open sea. She was just stayed on the River Lagan in Belfast, where she was built. And it was a very, very cursory inspection. But nevertheless, she got a certificate of seaworthiness. So obviously there was, shenanigans going on there. And so, right, moving on to her maiden voyage. Wednesday, the 10th of April, 1912, Titanic left Southampton. The new Titanic, in other words, Olympic, left Southampton on its maiden voyage to New York amidst huge celebrations, in contrast to what happened with Olympic. Now, you'd think that the big celebrations would be reserved for the first one off the production line, wouldn't you? But no, for some reason, and I'll come on to that in a second, it was Titanic that had all this big fuss and razzmatazz and, you know, full page spread, inside page spreads on newspapers saying the maiden voyage of this biggest ship in the world, blah, 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 blah. And yeah, I found that very strange. And then it kind of clicked with me why that will be. And I'll come on to that very shortly. Okay, now, interestingly enough, the first of all, Titanic, most people don't realize this, but it was only half full. Okay, it could have had many, many more passengers and crew on board. And the strange thing about that is that there was actually a coal strike going on in the UK at that time. Now, it had been going on for 6 weeks. And of course, all big ships ran on coal. They needed coal and lots of it. And there were lots of liners laid up and laying empty around all the different dockyards all around the country. As I said, by the day of Titanic's sailing, the coal strike had been going on for 6 weeks. Passengers were desperate for berths on ships going across the Atlantic. But there were no ships, or very, very, very few ships were actually sailing because they couldn't get hold of coal. For example, just to give you an idea of how much coal these huge ships used, it would have taken 6,000 tons of coal to get Titanic across the Atlantic. So it's a lot of coal. So, you know, the fact that there was a coal strike was very, very significant. And also significant was that 5 days earlier, 5 days before Titanic sailed, a ship by the name of SS Californian had departed for New York from London in the midst of this nationwide coal strike and shortage with no passengers. And bear in mind that passengers were desperate for berths and they were paying way over the odds on the very few ships that you know, were sailing, and there were very, very few. So there was no passengers despite this huge demand, and no cargo at all, except for, and get this, 3,000 woolen sweaters and 3,000 woolen blankets, and that was all she carried. This is at SS California. Okay. Now, as I said, in fact, even Titanic sailed only half full when there was this huge demand for places. First-class passengers hoping to transfer to Titanic were only offered second-class accommodation. And in those days, of course, no self-respecting first-class passenger would ever accept a second-class cabin. So was this an attempt to keep numbers manageable? I believe so. Right. So on the evening of the 14th of April, this is the evening of the disaster, Californian actually stopped dead in the middle of the ice field where Titanic was due to pass shortly, and she drifted with the ice whilst keeping all the boilers fully fired. Now, 3 experienced transatlantic sea captains gave evidence at the American inquiry that it was not common practice to stop or even slow down in ice fields, except sometimes in foggy conditions, because icebergs are extremely visible and therefore avoidable, even at normal cruising speeds. So at 11:40 p.m. local time on the 14th of April, Titanic allegedly hits the iceberg and sinks 3 hours later with a loss of 1,500 lives. Now, I questioned, was there even an iceberg? But again, that's something we'll come on to. Now, interestingly, Titanic's turning circle was such that it should have easily been able to spot the iceberg in good time and avoid it. And officially, it wasn't spotted until it was too late, in quotes. But in reality, we know that it was seen 4 miles away which of course does not fit the official story at all. Now, all the ice on the decks, we know that there was lots of ice on the decks after the event, after the collision, alleged collision. Now, this could easily have been the result of shaking loose large quantities of ice from the miles of overhead rigging and wiring, and actual deck buildings, you know, all the buildings on the deck itself. Because what happened was the engines were, when the collision occurred, alleged collision occurred, the engines were immediately thrust into reverse. So that would have caused a lot of ice to be shaken loose. Now, people said that, yeah, of course it hit an iceberg because there was ice all over the deck. When, you know, the stories about people making joking remarks about, you know, go out on deck and fetch me a piece of ice for my drink, and you know, young men playing soccer with all the pieces of ice that are skating around the deck. So there's all those stories which I think are probably true, but yeah. Now, interestingly, there was some very, very strange damage to Titanic. According to official reports, the steel plates, which were, by the way, they were an inch thick, the steel plates. Now, they had a 4-inch wide puncture, so 4 inches wide puncture, that at some places penetrated 5 feet, or just over 5 feet, into the inner skin of the ship. Now, that is a very strange, you know, 4 inches wide, 5 feet long. That's a very, very strange. It would have needed a very, very strange shaped piece of ice outcrop on an iceberg to achieve that. And that would surely have snapped off in contact with the steel. I mean, ice is known to be very strong, but it's not as strong as steel.
Curious about a natural way to boost your immunity and stay healthy? Well, stick around. I've got some fantastic information for you. Hi, I'm Mia with the Sensible Hippie podcast. Let's talk about the incredible benefits of elderberries. First, elderberries are packed with antioxidants and vitamins that help boost your immune system. This means fewer colds and stronger defense against illness. Second, they have anti-inflammatory properties that can help reduce inflammation and pain, perfect for keeping your body feeling great. And finally, elderberries are known to support healthy heart, improving circulation and reducing cholesterol. A heart-healthy choice. Llama Natural Elderberry Gummies are a delicious and easy way to enjoy these benefits. Try them today and feel the difference. Go to llamanaturals.com and enter code OHANA for a 20% discount. That's llamanaturals.com. llamanaturals.com.
Just to reiterate about the Federal Reserve situation at this point in time. So 7 prominent men who represented various financial interests, they met in secret on Jekyll Island to hatch a plan to usurp the power to create money from the American government. And this was to be the Federal Reserve Bank. But as I said, it was with, you know, there was strong opposition to it from certain mega rich people. And of course, one of the prime movers behind it was JP Morgan. Anyway, the 4 guys that were involved in this plot, involved in opposing this plot, it wasn't through any kind of concern for the common people, but they knew that the Federal Reserve Plan would mean soaring inflation and inbuilt debt, which would severely impact their own fortunes, of course, because, you know, inflation is a hidden tax in effect, isn't it? So these 4 men had created this strong resistance movement on the East Coast, which was beginning to win the battle against the Federal Reserve conspirators. Now, as I said, 3 of those men died on the Titanic. Coincidence? Well, let's see. I mentioned about the hyped up maiden voyage of Titanic. This was obviously done by JP Morgan. And I believe it was to entice the rich and famous onto the ship. And there was a lot of famous celebrities of the day on the Titanic, where that wasn't the case with Olympic. I believe he did it to lure those guys onto the Titanic through personal invitation in order to get rid of them, because he knew that the Titanic or Olympic was going to sink. So actually, Morgan, who was due to go on the maiden voyage, he actually mysteriously failed to show up at Southampton docks in time for the departure of the ship. And not only himself, but around 50 of his friends and business colleagues also failed to show. So I believe that's how he lured Astor, Guggenheim and Strauss on board, by this personal invitation and by booking a passage for himself, which obviously then they wouldn't find anything suspicious about that. So, okay, well, let's talk a little bit about how the accident was facilitated and how did they expect to pull it off, this deception. Right, okay, well, first of all, I don't think it was an accident at all. I believe that Stanley Lord, who was captain of the Californian, and by the way, he was no relation to Walter Lord, who wrote the story. I did some research into both their backgrounds, and there's no connection. It's just coincidence that both the surnames is Lord. Now, I believe that Stanley Lord, the captain of the Californian, was also in on the plot. Now, Californian was owned by the Red Star Line, which was also owned by J.P. Morgan. And several years previously, Stanley Lord had successfully evacuated 2,000 people from a ship in under an hour in a military exercise. So he was the perfect man for the job. Now, I believe it was the intention to save most of the passengers and just allow a select few, including the Federal Reserve opposition, to become victims to cover up the disposal of them, those specific people. Now, the idea was that Californian will be standing by, complete with the 3,000 blankets and 3,000 sweaters, to pick up most of the survivors. And several passengers actually significantly said afterwards, and these reports appeared in the newspapers, and yeah, and they said that they'd been told by White Star Line staff at the time of the incident that Californian was on its way to pick them up. Yet Californian was totally incommunicado, 19 miles away, with its wireless switched off and beyond any kind of visible contact. And there'd been no communications between Californian and Titanic at all at that point, apart from 3 messages earlier informing Titanic, from Californian to Titanic, informing Titanic of her position. Now, why would she need to do that? And that was the only communication there'd ever been, and those communications never mentioned being on their way to pick them up. So the White Star Line staff must have been told by somebody at some point that, you know, this was happening. Now, how did they know? There was no communication between them. So, yeah, I mean, I've already mentioned that I think it's uncertain. Uncertain has been a very kind word, actually, as to whether she actually hit an iceberg. I think if she did, then she was probably deliberately steered into one, or maybe sunk by another ship, because there were several eyewitnesses that swore that they'd seen what they refer to as a yellow funnel ship, and the funnel is the smokestack. Okay, so they'd seen a yellow funnel ship directly alongside Titanic at the time of the incident, and this is known as the yellow funnel steamer mystery. This ship was seen in the vicinity of Titanic at the time of the sinking by crew members of the nearby Californian, and indeed when the Carpathia, which was the rescue ship, it was Californian, never arrived. Nobody understands why, but Californian never arrived, and all the survivors in the lifeboats were picked up by a ship called the Carpathia. Now, when Carpathia picked up Titanic survivors, there was a lifeboat there that didn't belong to Titanic. So where did that lifeboat come from? My only explanation is it could have been off the Yellow Funnel steamer, but who knows? Now, Carpathia picked up all the survivors around 3 hours after the ship sank. And there were 705 survivors out of 2,200 on board. So more than 1,500 people died. Now, interestingly enough, Carpathia was fitted out like a hospital ship, and she had 7 doctors on board. Again, that's just a mystery. We don't know what that was all about, or whether it was significant or just a coincidence. We don't know, but I just think it's an interesting point. So after the event, all the passengers were docked at New York by the Carpathia, and the American inquiry was hastily convened. At the time, and still probably in certain circles, both the American and the British inquiry were widely thought to be whitewashers. Okay, so it was just covering up the facts. There were no witnesses called from the passenger contingent at all, and no witnesses were allowed to give personal evidence. They were strictly forbidden from speaking, other than to give simple answers to direct questions with no elaboration at all. And when questioned by the press, Captain Lord of the Californian was the ship that was supposed to be the rescue ship, said, "I am not allowed to give out state secrets. You'll have to ask those in the office," which is a very strange thing to say, isn't it? Now, 2 weeks after the inquiry, the surviving crew members arrived back in England, and they were all illegally detained overnight in a holding pen in Plymouth docks without access to legal or union representation, and they were coerced into signing a document that they believed was the Official Secrets Act. Now, the Official Secrets Act was a British, because don't forget, in 1912, when this all happened, it was just in the run-up to the First World War, which began in 1914 in Europe, of course. So at that point in time, the British government had devised this thing called the Official Secrets Act, and it was to make sure that people kept their mouths shut about certain things that were going on. So yeah, they had to sign this Official Secrets Act thing. Okay. Now, going back to the iceberg, did she really hit an iceberg? There were only 5 eyewitnesses that claimed that they saw it. One was William Murdoch, who was the first officer. The 2 lookouts in the crow's nest, the helmsman, the guy who steers the ship, and one other ordinary seaman. Now, significantly, Murdoch allegedly committed suicide in the aftermath of the collision. That left as the only witnesses 4 working class men. And I stress the importance of the fact that they were working class men, because that would have been very, very easy to keep them quiet through threats to their and their families' livelihoods. You know, in those days, working class men knew their place, and you know, they if their betters, as they referred to them, asked them to jump, their only question would have been how high. They'd never question anything at all. So it would have been very easy to keep them quiet through threats and other stuff. Now, so was Titanic set up by Captain Edward Smith of the Titanic, on the orders of J.P. Morgan, to enter an ice field at high speed, with the intent of ramming her with the Yellow Funnel steamer, which could well have been an icebreaker of some kind, in order to provide a plausible cover story. In other words, to kill 2 birds with 1 stone, collect the insurance payout for the wrecked Olympic, and also to rid the Federal Reserve conspirators of their powerful enemies. That's my question. Now, there were 6 significant deaths. Captain Smith himself, Chief Officer Wild, who was second in command, First Officer Murdoch, who I've just mentioned. I suspect all 3 of those were actually in on the plan, and then plus Guggenheim, Strauss, and Astor, the Federal Reserve opposition. There's no real eyewitness evidence of what happened to any of them. According to the official story, none of them attempted to escape. Captain Smith allegedly decided to go down with the ship. Murdoch allegedly shot himself. Guggenheim was the guy, for those who've seen the James Cameron Titanic movie with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. Guggenheim was the guy who allegedly dressed in his best and prepared to go down with the ship like a gentleman. Astor apparently just walked away, never to be seen again after being denied access to a lifeboat. And we're told that Strauss and his wife retired to their stateroom to await death together peacefully. All very romantic and melodramatic stuff, not to mention very convenient, of course. Now, it's highly significant to me that Guggenheim, Astor, and Strauss were all well-known opponents of the Federal Reserve System. And significantly, perhaps, they were also the most well-known of the victims. Very few of victims actually were first-class passengers. So the fact that those three guys, all first-class, died is too much of a coincidence to me. Most first-class passengers survived, not all, but most. But those three were among the ones that didn't. So you think at least one of them would survive, wouldn't you? But anyway, okay. So the upshot of it all was that Morgan had got his insurance payout, and the Federal Reserve came to pass the following year with little to no resistance. And by the way, the Federal Reserve Act was passed on the 23rd of December. The Federal Reserve Bill was passed on the 23rd of December, 1913, when something like 85% of Congress was away on the Christmas holidays. So that was interesting. Yeah. Now, I believe that this also required the collusion of the British government and the American government as well. But that's another story. I won't go into the details of that. But the British government of the day, the Prime Minister was a guy by the name of Herbert Asquith at the time. I believe that they were complicit in this scheme because they knew that if Olympic had to be scrapped, then Harland and Wolff and White Star Line would have gone too. It's almost certain that Morgan would have cut his losses and pulled out, and the damage to the British economy, the unemployment figures, there would have been 30,000 alone at Harland and Wolff, plus another 30,000 at White Star, and several more thousand plus in dependent industries. Then the Liberal Party, which was the government of the day, they would have absolutely faced a humiliating defeat in the next election. Titanic's wreck, as I mentioned, Robert Ballard had those mysterious, unaccounted for steel support struts bracing the keel. And this was consistent with the alleged repairs to Olympic after the Hawke incident, the Hawke battleship incident. So, yeah, it's impossible to me that the whole thing could have happened without the collusion of both governments. You know, I mentioned the massive political repercussions there, and the Liberal Party probably wouldn't have been re-elected. But probably more importantly, Morgan agreed, right, in those days, in 1908, when Morgan bought the White Star Line, foreign nationals were not allowed to own British shipping lines for whatever reason. But I believe that Morgan agreed that on taking over White Star Line, when he negotiated the purchase, that any White Star Line ship could be requisitioned as a troop carrier in the event of war. And even as early as 1908, they knew that war was coming in Europe. The British government knew this, of course. In fact, real history tells us that the financiers have been planning World War I for at least 2 decades. So, you know, again, that's another story for another day. But, you know, and I think the Federal Reserve Bank was the stepping stone to bring this about. And the Federal Reserve Bank, the foundation of the Federal Reserve Bank, was actually the catalyst for World War I. Because, as you know, wars are very, very expensive. The Federal Reserve Bank was introduced to generate the money because all central banks, of which the Federal Reserve Bank is obviously the American central bank, they create money out of thin air. Again, this is another story for another time, but this enabled them to fund World War One. Very short explanation there, but we'll leave it at that. Now, it's also, I discovered, as part of my research, that it was actually a common scam in those days to switch ships' identities. So this is not an unusual occurrence in many ways. And, Captain Lord, over the years, he died in about 1962, I think. So 50 years later, Stanley Lord, he tried to clear his name because he was actually blamed for the disaster. He was supposed to come to the rescue, but he didn't for whatever reason. Nobody knows why. He tried many, many times over the years to clear his name, but they would not allow him to do this. They wouldn't allow him a public platform to clear his name because obviously, if he'd been given a platform to try to clear his name, then lots of uncomfortable truths would have come out. So he was never given that opportunity. And sadly, he died never having done that. There's lots of other things I can mention. I'll just take another drink, actually. Won't be a sec.
You mentioned that there were several large underwater explosions that were detected by ships passing near the area before the Titanic wreck was found. Do you think these explosions, I guess, kind of fit all this of what could have happened to the Titanic and this metal plate that you were talking about that exploded?
No, I think what the explosions were, this was in 1953. They were actually searching for the wreck in 1953, and they did actually find it. And what the explosions were, it was a very early method of actually producing an underwater image of what was down there on the seabed, 12,000 feet from the surface. And it was a methodology that they used. I can't remember the name of it now, but that was a methodology whereby these explosions would create an image, and so they could actually see a sort of image of the ship under the water. That's what those explosions were. They were nothing to do with the actual ship itself. It was just a methodology by which they were creating images of the seabed to try to find Titanic.
I see. And you pointed that that plating in the photograph in your book, it was pushed outwards.
Yeah,
suggesting
absolutely.
some kind of internal explosion.
Yeah. Now sorry, Maya, yeah, go on.
No, go ahead.
What I think that was unbeknown to most people, the crew were aware, but obviously none of the passengers were, that one of the coal bunkers within the ship was actually on fire for the entire voyage. Now, I believe that when the ship began to sink, and obviously it was immersed in the water, it could either been the fire in the coal bunker, or it could have been the fact that cold water pouring into the engines and the boilers created an explosion of some kind, because obviously the boilers contained fire. So it could have been an explosion of some kind, but there is a huge hole in the side of the ship, which is clearly visible in some photos. But as you say, the metal plates are pushed outwards rather than inwards. So it wasn't the iceberg damage, if it was an iceberg. It was actually some kind of internal explosion, but we don't really know what it was. There's another little interesting aside here. There was one of the White Star Line seamen was called Lewis Klein. Now, he was a witness to what happened, but his name has been expunged from the crew list for some reason. It doesn't appear in any of the crew lists, but we know that he existed, and we know that he was telling the truth because he, well, first of all, let me tell you, Lewis Klein, he could speak very little English, okay, and he shouted a warning to the lookouts and to the bridge, but he said there was no one there apart from an officer lying motionless, who we believe to be drunk, on a bench in the bridge, you know, the area where the ship is steered from and controlled from. Now, on arrival at New York, Lewis Klein was placed under house arrest and subpoenaed to appear at the American inquiry, but he escaped and failed to show. But before that, he'd actually given a written testimony, which was translated from German, which was his native language, and this was submitted to the inquiry. So this is how we know that it existed, because this appears in the inquiry transcripts. And he said, and I'll just bring up the quote here. Right, he said, there was a ball following a banquet of some kind going on down below when I went up on watch at 9:30. And the captain and the officers were there with many passengers. After the party, the stewards sent the champagne and wines that were left over to the crew, and I know that many of them were drunk. A passenger standing at the rail saw something dead ahead, or maybe a little to the starboard. Look, quick, see the hill over there. I saw it was a big iceberg and ran for the bridge. The third officer was coming along and yelled to me to ask what the matter was. I couldn't stop to answer, I was too excited. I ran for the spar with the crow's nest on it and shouted to the lookout I knew was up there to give the alarm. Not a word did I hear, so I started up the spar. It was less than a minute after I left the promenade deck that I got to the top of the spar and found the lookouts fast asleep. I rang the alarm bell myself. Now, it's interesting that Lewis Klein disappeared. Nobody knows what on earth happened to him, where he went, but this testimony does appear in the American Inquiry transcript. So, yeah, it's all very, very strange. Now, again, so yeah, the Titanic cost £2.5 million to build, which in 1910, 11, 12 money was probably about $250 million, which is, you know, a lot of money. I mean, it's a lot of money then, but it's a lot of money now still. But yeah, now, so we know the badly damaged Olympic was uninsurable, and White Star Line normally insured ship for around 75% of their value. So the payout for Titanic should have been about 1.8 million. But in fact, the insurance on Titanic was upped the week before the maiden voyage to 3.2 million. And this was paid out within a week of the disaster. So, yeah, lots and lots of stuff. I don't know if there's anything else you want to ask about, but in a kind of a very small nutshell, that's the story. But, you know, the full story appears in my book, as you know, and it's far more comprehensive than what I've just told you.
Yeah, that's true. You also mentioned that the James Cameron, well known for his passionate Titanic, everything that he loves about that. But what I didn't know, he was a 32nd degree Mason, and ascend to the 33rd degree around the time of the Titanic movie was released. That's when he, I guess, got that.
Yeah, no, it was on the night of the Oscars. You know that Titanic absolutely cleaned up at the Oscars. You know, it just about won just about every award you can imagine. It was the night of the Oscars when he was elevated to 33rd degree. Yeah.
Do you think that there's any significance or connection between the Masonic involvement of any of this, or the film's production and timing of this?
Absolutely. I mean, the Masons are involved in absolutely everything, sadly. You know, they pervade the whole of our society, and you know, everything is very Masonic controlled and run, isn't it? And they have a lot of rituals and they love their numerology and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, absolutely, it was all a Masonic thing. Absolutely, yeah.
Wow. What about given the conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic, do you think that the recent implosion of the Titan submersible that killed 5 people on that tour to the Titanic could be part of something larger or suspicious agenda or something like that, or deliberate?
Yeah, definitely. I think it was done to deter people from actually visiting the wreck, because they know that the wreck holds a lot of secrets, and if they come out, you know, such as the struts on the keel, for example. But that's just one example. But for example, nobody's seen the actual damage that the iceberg caused. Now, if the silt on the seabed eventually wears away or drifts away, and they can see where the damage was supposed to be, if it didn't look like they've told us it was, then that could be a severe problem for them. They'd obviously make some story up, but yeah, I think it was done to deter people from actually visiting the wreck.
That's interesting. I wondered that if that was something to do with all of that. Wow, that's a
Because I think
shame.
when they planned to sink her where they did, that actually happens to be, by pure coincidence, of course, the deepest part of the Atlantic. I believe that in those days, they thought that the wreck would never be found. But of course, they didn't have the technology then. And you know, so yeah, it's all,
Wow.
it's all very suspicious, isn't it?
It is. It really is. Wow, that was so amazing. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your book. I read through it, and it's just amazing. I loved every part of that book. And I
Thank you.
believe that the Titanic continued on successfully, the real Titanic, what, for
Yes.
25 years? But of course,
That's
under
right.
Olympic or something,
That's
right?
right. Yeah. And of course, if that had really been the Olympic, there is no way she could have stood the rigors of 25 years of crossing the Atlantic. The North Atlantic's very, very dangerous place. You know, it's a very wild place. You know, the damage that she sustained, it's just impossible. It could not possibly have been the Olympic.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Well, thank you
Yeah.
so much for coming back to the show, John. It was amazing conversation as usual. As
Thank you.
always, yeah, I loved it. You definitely gave us a lot to ponder, especially with the compelling discussion of the Titanic and the switch of the ships and that
Yep.
theory. I'm sure our audience can find a lot to ponder on that. But before
Yeah.
we go, where can our audience find you and your work?
Okay, well, I have a website which is called falsificationofhistory.co.uk. I have a BitChute channel, which is John Hamer Official. And all my books are available on Amazon, Amazon wherever you are in the world. So just key my name into the search bar at the top and it will bring up my author page with all my books. And, you know, they can be ordered through Amazon. If there are any UK viewers, then I can actually provide signed copies. I don't post them abroad because they get lost. The number of, I used to, but the number of times that they get lost in the post or they get refused by customs as well, and it was just costing me so much money that unfortunately I don't post abroad anymore. But certainly in the UK, if anyone wants to contact me directly, you know, I don't mind if you put my email address on the you know, the blurb with the the show notes. That's the word. Thank you.
Awesome. Yes, yes. Are you working on anything new right now?
Yeah, I'm doing another collaboration, another book with a friend, and it's about it's called Beyond the Wall, and it's about what is beyond the Antarctic ice wall, which is very, very hush hush, of course. Something called the Antarctic Treaty. You're not allowed to go there. You're not allowed to overfly it. You're not allowed to go within miles of the Antarctic without specific permission. And sadly to say, we know that any plane that encroaches is warned to turn around, and if they don't, they get shot down. And the same with ships. The ships will be shot at as well if they go anywhere too close. So what is going on there? We'll have to wait for the book to come out to find out.
Yes. Oh, I can't wait for that. And out of all your books that you've written, which is your favorite again? My
favorite is Behind the Curtain, which has the strapline, the subtitle, if you like, of expose of the banking industry. But it's more than that. It's much more than that. That's just part of it. I really made a mistake when I put that as the subtitle. It should have said an expose of the New World Order. You know, what is actually going on in the world, how they falsified events over the years. It's a bit like falsification of history, except it goes into much, much more detail. So yeah, and I contacted Amazon to try to get them to change the subtitle, but they said, if you do that, it will have to be regarded as a completely different book. So you'd lose all your existing reviews. You know, and it's got lots of 5-star reviews, so I didn't want to do that, you know.
No, exactly. Well, I definitely want to have you come back to discuss that one.
Sure. No
Well,
problem.
thank
I'd love
you.
to. Yeah, I really
Yay.
enjoy our chats. It's been great. Thank you.
And that brings us to an end of another episode. I want to thank my guest, John Hemmer, for sharing his deep insights into the Titanic and the intriguing theory that it wasn't the ship we think it was that sank that faithful night. John, you've certainly given us a lot to ponder, and I appreciate the thoroughness of your research and the compelling case you've presented. As always, I want to remind everyone that the opinions and views expressed by my guests are not necessarily my own. We bring on unique voices to learn from each other, even if we don't agree on everything. This diversity of thought is what makes our discussions so enriching. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a positive review, follow, subscribe, and share. I aim to keep the show free, but running it is very expensive. To help with this, I include links with discount codes in the show notes. If you make purchases through these links, it supports the show without any extra cost to you. I'm doing my best to avoid asking for subscriptions. I may have to in the future, but in the meantime, if you find it in your heart to support the show, consider buying me a coffee or making a small donation. Every bit helps the show to keep going. Thank you again for all your support and being part of this journey. Until the next time, stay curious, stay open-minded, and sensible. Ahui ho kako. Bye!